Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. Eric LaMontagne is here as co-host and co-producer. Nice to join us this evening.
Thank you.
And our special guest, and very timely guest, is Mike Covey, who is the Executive Director for Vermont Traditions Coalition. Mike, welcome back.
Thanks, Pat.
Yes,
Nice to be
been
here.
on the show before. We are talking about the closing or the proposed closing by the governor of the Salisbury Fish Culture Station, which has created quite a little bit of stir out in the outdoor community. And so we asked Mike here to talk about if it's a good idea or a bad idea. Let me guess. So first we have to ask you to talk a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a lifelong Vermonter, with the exception of a couple of years that I spent at the University of New Hampshire down on the coast. And I grew up farming, hunting, fishing. I actually didn't grow up trapping. I came into that as an adult. But you know, the Vermont Traditions Coalition advocates for the protection and promotion of our landscape-based recreational and occupational opportunities. So, you know, forestry, agriculture, snowmobiling, hunting, fishing, and trapping, all of these interconnected interests that are all tied together by the common theme of the working landscape.
Great.
And it's been a really fun, it is a really fun opportunity for me to be able to advocate for the things that make up the bulk of my interests in life and my passions in life.
It's sort of fun if you like what you're doing there.
It's very
That's
fun.
great.
I don't feel like I work anymore. I feel like I.
So
you
is this your job? I mean, is this?
It is.
I thought
yeah.
you did that maybe on your volunteer side, but this is your job.
This
That makes
this
it
is
even more special.
yeah. I've volunteered in this arena for 6 years now, I believe. 7 years now. Starting with some involvement in the Berlin Pond issue.
Oh yes, I recall. I
And,
think that's where we sort of first met. That was
I believe it is. Yeah.
right.
So I got started there, and it snowballed very rapidly to working with a number of organizations that are all doing good things for our state: the Vermont Trappers Association, the Vermont Federation of Sportsmen's Clubs, that are really all crucial components of the fish and wildlife palette, as it were, and toolbox.
Excellent. Good job. We're
Well,
glad you're there.
Yes, absolutely. We need more people fighting for traditional activities here in Vermont. And speaking of which, let's talk a bit about the outdoor recreation as an industry in Vermont, and we'll get to hunting in a little bit. But starting with fishing, because that has kind of been a topic that's in the news with the initial proposal to close Salisbury. Tell us a little bit about the role of fishing in Vermont, some of the numbers that might go along with that.
So, fishing in Vermont is an economic driver to the tune of over $100 million a year.
Wow.
It's significant. You know, a great deal of people engage in fishing, more so than most of the other, more so than any of the other outdoor pursuits. Fishing over the last 20 years, fishing license sales have basically held steady, where we've seen a decline in hunting license sales that's been fairly marked. So in terms of, you know, to relate it to the hatchery closure, just our trout stocking programs, the economic impact of the trout stocking programs alone, which we can get into more of later. Salisbury essentially drives that entire program. The economic impact of that is a little over $31 million annually. So it's very significant.
Wow. Well, I would think, I mean, fishing, unless you go for the really high end this and that, it's a fairly, I don't want to say cheap, but inexpensive sport compared to
Easily
hunt.
accessible.
It is.
Yeah,
It's very
and it's
accessible.
for kids can get involved in it, and you don't have
Yep.
to, hawk your house and take out a second mortgage. You can
Yep.
just go have fun.
Well, that's it. I mean, I
Yeah.
imagine beyond just the numbers, there's a pretty valuable social component to that's worth protecting here.
Yeah, certainly. And like you said, it's very accessible.
Yeah.
You know, you can still take a length of twine and a fish hook and
I was
tie him
gonna
to a
say
stick
that,
and catch
well,
fish.
They can't do that anymore, but
You can
why not?
absolutely do that.
Yeah.
I've done it. And you know, it's to a degree, it's more gratifying than going out there with a bunch of really high priced gear.
Right.
To do it in a really thrown back sort of a manner is entertaining. There may be some degree of that's becoming social. You know, in bow hunting, we're seeing a real a rise in the use and interest in traditional bow hunting. People using recurves and longbows. So
I saw one of those, the newer bows that can shoot like, you know, they're all like, there's 4 or 5 of them. I mean, these things are enormous.
Yeah,
and
they're great.
I don't even know what the cost is, but I bet it's not $1.98.
It contributes to the
yes,
economy.
Yes, it does, and we love them. We've talked about, wanted to talk about the governor's recommendation to close, so why don't you jump right in there? And I don't know how many people know about fish hatcheries in general. I was just telling you, I went to the Ed Weed opening of that fish hatchery after Ed passed away, longtime Vermonter and supporter of the outdoor sports. And that was someplace really high tech.
Yeah. So I don't want to get too mired in the governor's proposal. I think we're better served by noting that the governor actually was willing to pull together a bunch of people from the community and have a sit down with us. And you know, we urged people to phone and email the governor's office and the Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife and the Secretary of ANR. And
Eric.
And Eric did, yep.
Yeah, just so folks know that are listening, Eric wrote an incredible commentary that was picked up by a lot of media here in Vermont, so it got the attention of the governor.
Well, and it was a very combined effort from a lot of organizations when this proposal came out, because it's one of those issues, as we said, it affects, you know, fishing is something that affects so many different people for so many different reasons, whether it's the family that comes into town and spends that week together on Lake Champlain, or the guy who takes his grandson fishing in the stream out back, or the retail shop who is in a very rural area, and that the role that bait shop plays for that community. It's so important, and it was really good to see when this proposal did come out that there were many voices that were represented in the conversation, and the governor was very open to the conversation.
I was impressed with that when you called me and said that he wanted to meet.
Yeah, it was really a quick response on the part of the administration to call for a sit down with us and really have what I think was a very productive and open discussion about you know, what the perceived need was moving forward, and what ideas could be utilized to promote that net result that we were all hoping for.
Right, because you told me before, each hatchery has a specific purpose, so that if you take one hatchery out, you've got a hole in, we were kidding about the hole in the bucket, but there's a hole in the system. Right. And fishing, I would think, is a real attraction for tourists here. I mean, you know,
I would think so, because you can buy a 3-day fishing license if you're just up for the weekend.
Oh, well, perfect.
You know, and so licenses, fishing and hunting licenses, contribute about a third of the department's annual budget.
Right.
It's about $7 million annually.
And I don't know if people know that the Fish and Wildlife Department relies on the income they get from licenses. They are self-funded.
Yeah,
they don't get. I don't think they get much general fund.
They get their funding is about a third of it comes from hunting and fishing and trapping licenses. A third of it comes from Pittman Robertson and Dingle Johnson, which are otherwise known as the. So, the department's budget is funded through a number of streams. They get about a third of their funding from the hunting and fishing licenses, so it is a significant contributor. About 1/3 of their funding comes from Pittman-Robertson Act and the Dingle-Johnson Acts, which are National Wildlife Restoration
so federal
and
dollars.
National Sport Fish Restoration Acts. And those acts, those funds, both are derived from the purchase of the equipment that's utilized to hunt and fish and trap. So Pittman-Robertson is funded through excise taxes on hunting equipment, on trapping equipment, and on firearms and ammunition sales. Dingle Johnson is funded from sources like boat purchases, excise taxes on boat purchases, and fishing gear, etc. So not only are the sportsmen contributing a third of the
Right.
the input to the department through their license sales, they're contributing another third of the input to the department through their purchases of
And is the last third, is that a general fund?
well, about
Because-
25% comes from the general fund,
Okay.
and then the remainder comes from smaller sources, non-game wildlife contributions, contributions on tax.
Do you have
forms, et
any
cetera.
idea when the general fund started to contribute?
I don't know the
Because
answer to that.
that's not fairly new, but it
It's
hasn't been
relatively
always.
well in terms of the broad scope of the North American model of wildlife management. It's a newborn.
Yeah,
Um,
okay.
It's
Yeah,
it's
'cause-
very new in terms of that. For well over a century, hunters, trappers, and fishermen funded wildlife departments across the
Right,
country entirely. You know, and there was a different paradigm within society where that was acknowledged and respected, and it was. It's unfortunate that there are some organizations driving a narrative that says that sportsmen are greedy and evil.
We don't
when
think so.
when they've been carrying
Right.
the ball for a very long time, and generally when there's an issue that arises with a wild population, sportsmen are the ones who notice it because they're the ones that are out
They're
there
out
on the
there,
ground
right.
and they're engaged, and they're the ones that call for, hey, wait a minute, something doesn't seem right here. We should take a look at this. You know, that they're very conscientious and very invested in the resources themselves.
Well, and you brought up a good point there, Mike, where the people, the folks who are participating in hunting and fishing are the primary contributor to the fish and wildlife budget. But it should be pointed out that the dollars coming from the hunters and the fishermen are not used exclusively for supporting hunting and fishing, that those dollars go to a lot of other programs to protect all wildlife for all users and all consumers, whether it's birding, wildlife watching, whatever it may be. It's there's this weird political feeling right now where there's kind of a shunning of a lot of traditional Vermont activities, and I think a lot of people are not aware of the connection between the participation in those activities and supporting the environment for all Vermonters.
Jamie Fidel from VNRC once asked me, you know, what do you think we can do to get people more interested, to get people to buy into these concepts of land conservation? And I said, teach them how to hunt, fish, and trap.
Excellent
Give
answer.
them something to love, and then give
Yep.
them a place to do it.
Yep,
And you can't get somebody to buy in more than that.
right. I agree with you. And there's so many kid programs through Fish and Wildlife that they really try to attract the kids and give them all the experience they can. And as they grow up, hopefully they'll be stewards of the land as well.
Yep.
Because they'll
And-
learn young.
And you know, some of those programs are supported through the Salisbury Hatchery. That the eggs that are provided for Trout Unlimited's Trout in the Classroom program
Right.
come from Salisbury.
Oh, yeah. Why don't you talk about Salisbury, the fish, what it's about and what it does and what it supports?
So Salisbury is our oldest hatchery. It is a National Historic Site. It receives around 7,000 visitors, just shy of 7,000 visitors annually for tourism purposes.
Yeah, I had no idea it was
I didn't
that,
either.
it was
I
that
didn't-
high.
yeah.
That's
It's pretty
incredible.
significant.
That's incredible.
So Salisbury is our broodstock hatchery, and what that means is that they keep older fish there that are breeding age, breeding capable fish, and the strains that are bred there are brook, brown, rainbow, and lake trout, and two species of steelhead. Two strains of steelhead. So our stocking, we're not, the department's not overstocking. And when I say overstocking, I don't mean stocking too much. I mean stocking on top of successful native populations. The stocking is occurring in areas where native populations, for whatever environmental reason, are not breeding successfully. A lot of it goes into ponds, and provides those fishing opportunities for folks. So Salisbury, essentially, with the exception of one other hatchery, which I'll talk about in a bit, Salisbury provides the eggs for the other hatcheries to raise.
Oh, so if it went out of business, this could be a problem.
Right. So if Salisbury shut down today
Yeah.
and it just closed the doors, they can't move those brood stock, so our production would stop entirely. Then on top of having to create new infrastructure at other hatcheries to support some brood stock, most of those other hatcheries are operating near their outflow permits from DEC. So you can only add so much more biomass.
Right.
You cannot add the volume of biomass that is housed at Salisbury. I believe it's around 50,000 pounds of fish housed at Salisbury.
Dinner.
So there are logistical issues, there are infrastructure issues with trying to move brood stock. On top of that, these brood stock, the Salisbury hatchery has a strain of a disease, and you'll forgive me for not remembering the name of it. Within their brood stock, that they're able to prevent from translating into the eggs, but they don't want to move that brood stock to another hatchery.
Yeah, it can affect the other hatchery.
And potentially expose
Right.
the other hatcheries. So if we shut down Salisbury tomorrow, there would be a minimum, if we shut down Salisbury tomorrow and we had all the infrastructure in place to regenerate brood stock, it would take 3 to 7 years just to regenerate the brood stock.
Wow.
You know, the smaller species such as brook trout would be about a 3-year time span. The larger species, lake trout, would be a 7-year time span. The others would fall within that range. So for 3 to 7 years, we would have little or no stocking of trout species. Now, another potential impact of closure is that we're engaged in a regional kind of an egg sharing program, for lack of a, it's a collaborative program with New York, New Hampshire, and Maine. When we get muskellunge eggs to rear,
Whoops, what'd you say?
when we get muskellunge eggs, muskies,
Oh, muskies. I
to
know that.
rear,
Yeah.
those generally come from New York.
Yeah.
You know, if New York has more eggs than they're going to be able to use in the year, they'll call us up and say, hey, we've got muskie eggs, do you guys want them? And we'll get in a truck, you know, our department will get in a truck and head out there and pick them up, and we'll rear those eggs and relocate them, you know, reintroduce them to Champlain or the Missisquoi or one of those traditional habitats once they've been reared to fry.
Interesting.
We conversely have that ability with trout eggs. But if suddenly we don't have a surplus of trout eggs, then for one, the trout in the classroom program, you know, which we talked about getting people engaged at a young age, that we potentially can't support that anymore. And we potentially can't be of value to the other states that are engaged in this multi-state
Right.
commerce of eggs, essentially for free. You know, the cost of going and picking them up.
And
That's really
that
good.
that
Good for them.
the muskie stocking program has been a real success story in Champlain. Now we have some other barriers to it, such as removing some dams to open up more habitat, but that's been a big success story. And same with lake trout. We're finally, you know, lake trout was bolstered entirely by hatcheries for many, many years. But in the last 5 years, they've started to see a fairly decent rate of natural reproduction.
Great.
But you kept using the word strain, Mike. So can you speak a little bit about fish, like why care about the strains? What is Fish and Wildlife doing to match strains to certain environments? Can you just go into that a little bit?
I can't get too far into the weeds on that because I'm not a fisheries biologist.
Right.
But you know, a strain is essentially a subspecies, and so across geography, you get different subspecies. Turkeys, I'm fairly well versed in. So there are 5
We
subspecies
can talk
of
about
turkeys.
They're huge this year.
Well,
Something happened.
there are 5 subspecies of turkeys, and this strain thing within trout is similar. You know, trout that are in different watersheds may have different strains.
Yeah.
So we don't want to stock a non-native strain of brook trout over our
Right.
naturally reproducing
Right.
strain of brook trout. So these brood fish are strain specific.
Interesting. And do they have trouble if merging with, or like if you put in the same body of water, the wrong strain would Would
It
that
would
overpower the others, or?
overpower's not the right word. Um, it would corrupt
Oh.
the natural strain, I
Yeah.
guess is maybe the best way to put it.
Yeah.
So in a lot of the places these fish are stocked, as I noted before, there are no naturally reproducing trout for whatever environmental reason. But there are going to be places where there's potential for contact. So
Yep.
where those potentials for contact exist, we want to do the best to ensure the integrity of the natural
great.
strain.
This is not as easy as just building a
It's-
hatchery.
No,
It's
it's
not.
not. And in the wake of this potential, or the initial announcement about Salisbury, I think there was a lot of misinformation out there from the general public who might not realize that Fish and Wildlife does go out of its way a lot of times to make sure that the fish that they're putting into a body of water complement the
Right.
population that's already
Yeah,
in
so they
there,
can thrive. And,
instead of trying to, as you
Right.
said, kind of
Right.
corrupt what's
Right.
already there. Because there's some people out there that
Because-
don't like stocking, and
Sure.
that's a major argument that they have is we shouldn't do stocking.
Just
You're
let
mixing.
nature take its
They're
course?
Frankenfish. They're not real fish, but it's not true.
no, and you lost during Irene. Wasn't a fish hatchery gone? I mean,
Yep.
so there's one less we have anyway.
Right. So Roxbury Hatchery was destroyed during Irene,
Right.
and that was a trout hatchery, primarily brook trout, and it will be primarily brook trout and rainbow when it comes back online.
Oh, they're working to get it
They're-
back up.
they're-
Oh, good.
yeah, it's a little over a $6 million project to rebuild
Ouch.
that hatchery, but it is underway now,
Right.
and so with that hatchery down, our ability to produce trout with our infrastructure
Yeah.
that we have is reduced by 10%. If Salisbury went down, it would reduce that by an additional 25%.
Oh, seriously, that's not good.
And that 25% reduction would be over the long term. So with Salisbury and Roxbury both down, we would be down 35%. But even when Roxbury comes back online, we would still be down that 25%
And so
because
how many hatcheries are there now?
there are 5 state
including
hatcheries
Salisbury?
and 2 federal hatcheries in
Oh,
the
I
state
thought there
right
was
now.
more. Oh, interesting.
No, that's
Yeah.
it. And there are a couple of groups doing kind of private hatcheries. But the interesting aspect of that is that in terms of trout, the eggs for the private hatcheries are sourced from Salisbury.
Oh, wow.
And
This is not a good one to pick.
and they're sourced from Salisbury at very little expense. They are provided essentially at cost, maybe a
Nice.
nominal fee above cost,
Yeah.
for 2 reasons. Well, for primarily one reason, as I understand it, having asked some questions about this in preparation for this
Right.
event. The primary reason is that strain-specific stocking that we discussed. So if an individual is privately rearing fish, or an organization
Right.
or a company is privately rearing fish to sell to folks for their trout pond in the front yard
Yep.
or whatever, you still want that to be the appropriate strain because that trout pond could
Yeah,
wash out.
for sure.
We just talked about Irene. That was a
Yeah.
significant weather event.
Yeah.
And so we know that these things occur. So it behooves the state, rather than to try to make a bunch of money on their excess, to ensure that anybody in the state who is trying to make money is going to be interested in purchasing the eggs from them to keep that
Yeah, because
integrity.
you can't have them just dumping it
Right.
in some place without really knowing what they're
Right.
dumping.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So how did you all leave it with the governor?
We left it with the governor that he was interested. What we discussed was an interest in a fee increase, and that probably won't sit well with some folks. But it's an immediate solution to an immediate problem.
Right.
The current cost of a fishing license in the state of Vermont for a resident is $26, and that
That's
license
pretty on the
is,
low side from other states, right?
It
I
is.
think Eric and I were talking
Yeah.
about that. It's
Yeah, I
we have a
believe it's
little room
40
to grow a little bit in that area.
Yeah. So at $26, if I'm not an economist by any means, but there are 365 days in a year, and that means that my fishing license, the opportunity to fish on any given day, costs me about 7 cents.
Wow.
And so the discussion that was had, and the same applies for hunting licenses. So the discussion that's been had to this point is a $2 increase on the hunting license, a $2 increase on the fishing license, and a $5 increase on the combination license. A combination license is your hunting and fishing for the year.
Right.
Even with the $5 increase on the combination license, it still costs less than $50 a year, and there are opportunities to hunt and fish all year round.
And
every
this
day.
would be dedicated funds to keep Salisbury up and running?
These would be
Because I think that would be a key for the people who are paying the extra
these
bucks.
would be funds to bridge the gap in the department's
Right.
budget deficiency.
Okay, all right. So we'll go into the
which
big
will
part,
have
but
the effect of, on top of, it will also benefit the, there's a UVM cooperative
Yep.
arrangement with the department, wherein when they're doing a research project, UVM facilitates that. That has an expense, and that was another piece that would have likely been cut as a result of this shortfall. And that's a piece that, you know, we should all support. We have very good biologists in this state, and we have a department that I, from what I've seen from them in working on these topics, have a great deal of faith in. And so their research projects are part and parcel of being able to have that faith, and it's pretty crucial. So it would have affected more than just the Salisbury hatchery. The Salisbury hatchery would have been a portion of the cut.
So you have a lot of support for this idea, didn't you? What did the governor ask you to do?
The governor asked us to, essentially said, if you will write me a letter
Right.
of support for this fee increase, because the administration did not want to increase fees.
Yeah, right.
And there hasn't been an increase on hunting and fishing licenses for 4 years. They didn't want to increase any fees, but they said that they could be amenable to it if they had enough support shown from the outdoor community.
And are you hearing from what's been the reception from the outdoor community on this?
I haven't received any pushback. I have heard from nobody saying that they were opposed to it, because I think people understand
Well, if you're a
just
real
how
fisherman, you
significant
get the importance of a fish hatchery, I'm assuming.
well, and the special significance of this one.
Yeah. And how can we mess with what makes it historic? I mean, I didn't know we had historic
It's
fish
on the
hatcheries.
National Historic Registry.
As a building
Why
that
that is, I do not
Yeah.
know.
Huh.
But
just gonna
that's
check that out.
you know, that's another part of this conversation. If in the event that the hatchery was closed, it would still have to be mothballed. It would have to be maintained. It would have to be kept available to the public as a historic site.
Oh,
So there would be, you know, a realistic expense engaged in that
Yeah.
as well, you know, to keep it heated, to keep everything working.
even though it's old, it's gotten all the new technology in there, though, to keep the stock up.
I
and,
can't speak to that
Yeah.
specifically. There's a proposal that was sought and drafted in 2011, I believe. I could be wrong on that. It's been a couple of weeks since I looked at that proposal, but there was a proposal to update the hatchery across the board,
Oh, right.
which would be a significant expense, right around $12 to
Yeah.
$13 million.
Well, that's important to Vermont because you've got to keep that industry viable.
It
And
is.
keep people attracted. I'm sure they'd be attracted knowing we're keeping up with all the new technologies.
Well, and it would have significantly increased capacity too, or it would significantly increase
perfect.
capacity as well.
Now, there is an issue that we haven't talked about at the Salisbury play about water, correct? There's a water issue that
there's
has
a
to be
discharge
addressed.
permit issue.
Yeah. Is that easily fixed, or will that mess up the plans?
That's a topic of ongoing discussion.
Uh-oh.
Is that political
Yeah,
enough?
that's political. Good. Very PC.
That is a topic of
Yeah.
ongoing discussion. The hatchery is the primary source of water for an unnamed tributary to Howland Brook.
Oh,
So the hatchery is tapped into an underground aquifer.
yeah.
and is pumping all of the water the hatchery utilizes up from that aquifer. It then runs out of the hatchery and down a low spot into Halnon Brook. Initially, when the hatchery came subject to EPA regulations or DNR regulations, as those were developed, the outflow impacts were measured at the confluence with Halnon Brook. In, I believe, 2000, prior to 2010, the metering point was moved to essentially directly to the outflow of the hatchery. That's the only hatchery in the state that is measured at that point. Every other hatchery is measured where the outflow meets the confluence with a waterway. The position of DEC has been that unnamed tributary, they theorize that if the pumps were shut off, the unnamed tributary would be fed from a spring, because there are maps from the 1800s that have a blue line on them to a point beyond the hatchery. However, currently, they have acknowledged that the hatchery is essentially the source of this tributary. And that topic came up in that the pumps couldn't just be shut off, because if the pumps were just shut off, you would be dewatering the tributary. So it's my understanding that the conceptual shutdown would mean that the pumps would be slowly dialed back, under the theory that as that occurred, there would be a spring that would well up and recreate the tributary.
Ooh, that sounds really complicated, I think.
It sounds fairly complicated, and it sounds very hypothetical, because in none of our lifetimes has that been the case.
Interesting.
So it's a perhaps that's drawn by an old map.
Right. Oh, interesting. Eric, is there? We've been talking about this stuff. Did you cover anything else in your article that we haven't discussed here? I don't know if that's putting you on the spot.
Well, basically, the article that I did, we covered most of it piece by piece. We just focused on some of the economic impacts and why this was an industry that is valuable and worth protecting. It's 2,400 jobs, about $73 million in wages every year associated with the fishing industry. This is something that, it's the excise taxes were somewhere around 3.5 million, and that's federal dollars that we're just receiving. So we really looked at the numbers on this, and also where licenses have been steady. I think there's been a 2 or 3% growth recently on fishing licenses. Nationally, that number is up to 8%. So it's a pastime that is growing in popularity. So really, again, not being a financial person, looking at that, it seems that to divest in infrastructure at a point when it's a growing industry, a growing pastime, and you have more potential revenue, doesn't make a lot of sense. We should be protecting this so that we can adopt that national trend and recruit more people to be in it, because the more people we recruit, that just helps close the financial gap. So it's really, it has the potential, I think, to kind of almost be a self-healing problem here.
And I would go so far as to add to what Eric said, that to fall back on my statement about get somebody to love something and give them a place to do it. We have a lot of discussions going on in the State House right now about clean water. We've had a lot of ongoing discussions in our state, really specifically geared towards Lake Champlain, Lake Carmi, and a few others, about clean water. Well, how do you invest people in clean water? Get them out fishing.
Yeah,
well, that's it. People don't. It's until you make something tangible it's really hard to get people to care about it.
I've made a comparison that I've been criticized for by some, that folks who hunt, fish, and trap are more engaged, and I don't say that to detract from folks who don't in their engagement in nature, but there's a significant difference in being a spectator or being a participant. And once you're engaged in those, you know, the spectator walking past a brook notices how pretty it is, without a doubt.
Yeah.
The participant, the fisherman engaged in that brook, sees a ripple on top of it and knows there's a rock there, and he's thinking about the trout that's lying on the backside of it.
Cool.
You know, it's a more in-depth engagement with that natural world.
Right. Excellent.
Absolutely. So let's switch gears here for a bit and
Yeah, please, let's
talk
talk
deer
about
hunting.
Yeah.
I know that the big
Unless is there anything else we should cover on this?
Yeah, what did we-
What is the next step
Did
for
we
you
miss
guys?
anything before we move
Well,
on?
next steps for us are you know, trying to work with the legislature,
okay.
you know, with Ways and Means institutions and the other relevant committees,
But you've got enough
appropriations.
people behind you that maybe they'll
I think
raise the price, and there you
I
go.
feel like this conversation's headed in a very good direction.
Good.
Everything's subject to change without notice. We all know that.
Notwithstanding, isn't that the killer word?
Notwithstanding, yeah.
Notwithstanding.
So
It's all over.
we know that, you know, anything that's happening up there is subject to change without notice. But
We wanna
the
thank you for
sense
all the
that I
work.
get is a positive motion on it.
One of my greatest memories is actually fishing, trout, scrambled eggs, and gutting. I learned how to gut and put it on the fry pan for breakfast. Very good.
Yeah, we
Excellent stuff. Do we do a lot of catch and release, or we catch them and eat them?
that depends on who you are. That's a question you would have to ask well over 100,000 times to get all the answers to.
Oh, no kidding, because some people just enjoy catching and releasing.
Some people only catch and release. Some people, you know, I
but there's
catch.
no requirements, like a certain lake, you can't catch and release on this lake, or,
There are some. Our
that?
fishing regulations take up an entire book.
oh dear.
Yeah,
There are regulations that are from this bridge to this confluence. There are a lot of varied regulations across the state.
Okay, okay.
I would say that fishing and hunting are probably the two of the most strictly regulated pastimes in the state.
Right. Well, I'm sure the fish have to be a certain length. I watch, what's the main show with fishing out there? I watch that all the time. The Northland. The fish.
Oh, like
the,
Northwood's
yeah,
Law,
Northwood, yes, I
the
watch
game
that.
warden show.
The game warden, there has to be so many
Right.
numbers, or they have a cap on that, and then the length of the fish, and so I watch that all the time. I love that show.
Well, and all those regulations are rooted in that conservation ethic.
Right.
Right.
And probably thank goodness they're there. Anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want to make sure we.
No,
Let's
I
talk-
just
let's
thought
talk deer.
maybe we could start talking
Yeah.
a little bit about deer hunting. There's been some deer meetings going on, and if one thing's that's true, every deer hunter knows how to manage the herd the best, better than anybody else.
Yeah.
But can you talk to us a little bit about what that current discussion is? Because it seems like it may be more real than it has been in past years.
It is more real. I think that the board will soon be taking up some proposals from the Fish and Wildlife Department. There are a lot of changes. My read on those changes is that while it's a lot going on, I see places where they balance each other. That said, Eric made a very good point. There are 65,000 hunters in the state of Vermont.
And each one has a.
Each one has a different idea of
Right.
what we should do on deer. You know, we're fortunate that the only state with a higher per capita participation in hunting is Alaska.
Really, we're
yeah,
second.
We're second. We have 10% of our
excellent.
population who hunts,
Excellent.
and you know, if you include hunting, fishing, and trapping, that
Right.
number grows significantly. I think it's a little over 20% of our population engages in one of those three outdoor pursuits, or often all of them. You know, it's we notice an interesting dichotomy in that generally a lot of people may fish but not hunt or trap. Most folks who hunt fish as well,
Yeah.
and most folks who trap both hunt and fish as well.
You do 2 out of 3, right? hunting and
Yeah,
fishing.
I deer hunt, bird
Yeah.
hunt, turkey hunt.
Cool.
Fish.
So, so the laws that, or the regulations that are being proposed, the rule changes that are being proposed, would be a significant change from what we've had for a very long time. We have a spike horn rule that is very polarizing, and everybody calls it the spike rule. What it is an antler point restriction, so you cannot shoot a deer, a buck, that has less than 2 points on one side. It has to at least have a fork on one side of its antlers. It can't have just spikes. This new proposal would allow bow hunters to shoot spikes. It would also allow firearms hunters to shoot spikes in certain zones, those zones being largely zones with a significant degree of connected forested terrain, generally lower deer numbers and generally lower hunter participation in those areas. The spine of the Green Mountains, the Northeast Kingdom. The Northeast Kingdom, I shouldn't say it has lower hunter participation.
I would think they would have more.
But you know, the landscape creates a situation where hunters are more dispersed across it.
Oh.
So the secondary, or the kind of balance to releasing that restriction on shooting spike horns is that hunters currently can shoot 2 bucks in a year. With, you know, they can either shoot one with a bow, rifle,
And give
a
some
muzzleloader,
venison
and
to
one
their
other.
friends.
So they would only be allowed to shoot 1 buck under these new proposals for the entire season. So if you go out
Oh.
on the first day of bow season in October and you shot a spike horn,
You're done.
you may not shoot another buck for the rest of the year. And so that kind of balances the concept
Yeah.
behind the antler point restriction, was that it would help age the buck population a little bit, give us a more even age structure throughout that population. That was the concept behind it.
Right. Do we have
this
a,
is-
I don't mean to, but I remember years ago there was a huge issue about the health of the herd, and I think this was a long time ago, we cut back on how much could be hunted. Is the herd healthy? Is it good out there? Is it a number that's
I'm going to preface this by
did I ask something bad?
by repeating the fact that there are 65,000 hunters
I
in the
see, okay.
state, and
All right.
everybody has
Well,
a different
what
opinion.
do the Fish and Wildlife think? What does Lewis think?
The department's proposal really shows, and I think the doe permit proposals have shown over the years, the varied volume of doe permits that have been allowed for muzzleloader season. That they understand that the various areas of the state all have different herd
For
sizes.
sure.
Our wildlife management units are fairly large. So there's dichotomy even within those units, and that creates a lot of friction.
Yeah.
Then you've got hunters who think we should go to a restriction that has 3 points on one side, because then even more bucks will get through that first year. And you
Oh.
have the other group of hunters that says, I just want to be able to go out and
This
shoot a
is a
spike horn
no-win
and put it in the
decision.
freezer. They're not in, the department and the board are not in an enviable position, but
Right.
they're dealing with it. Despite that knowledge, they're taking it up,
Yeah.
which is appropriate. So I spoke about the, you know, where that restriction would be reduced, and the kind of counterbalance of having only 1 buck a year. The archery season would be, now currently runs for 3 weeks in October, well, almost 4 now. And then it stops, and it picks up again for 9 days in December, concurrent with the muzzleloader season.
Oh, I was going to ask you about that.
This new proposal would have the archery season run straight through until the end of muzzleloader season.
Oh, how many people actually are involved in muzzleloader?
I don't
season?
have those
Oh,
numbers.
you
That
know,
would
I
be a
just-
question for the
that is-
commissioner.
That's quite the art.
I suspect he
Because
does.
you
but-
have to be, I'm assuming, very accurate and in order to actually kill the deer and take it down. That's something that's pretty uncontrollable or hard to control, I would think.
Well,
right?
a lot of the modern firearms
Are
have
they-
taken away
oh, is
some of the
that-
challenge of
Yeah.
the old, you know.
So doing this and but
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
it's
you
not,
still
Pull
have
the
to
thing
do
and
that.
doing it.
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, but it's not like Civil War era guns anymore.
Oh, is it right? It's all modern?
Yeah.
But there is, I mean, the difference is you can't take 3 or 4 shots right off the bat.
Yeah, one at a
Right,
time,
you have
right?
one
That's
shot.
it, yeah, and it zips off.
I will say, because I believe this merits discussion, I have a friend, he's a trapper, he's a very rustic fellow. When you get pancakes at his house, it's very likely that you're going to be cooked in rendered raccoon lard. He actually shot a
His
deer
name,
this
so we
year.
don't
He actually shot a deer this year with a matchlock, which is the most primitive type of firearm
Yep.
there is. Essentially, you have a very slow burning fuse on your hammer, and you have some powder in the pan, and you hope that by the time you've seen a deer and gotten the gun up and pulled the trigger, nothing has knocked the fuse out.
Wow.
It's the least probable ignition system available.
Interesting.
And he was actually able to harvest a deer with it this year.
Wow. He must have been close, or at least accurate, right? I
Yeah,
mean, 'cause
that one is more of the not so accurate.
not so accurate the old days.
he's
they look
exceptional.
at you and shoot and miss you.
Yeah, I mean, and there are, as I mentioned with bows, a lot of people reverting to the traditional archery equipment.
Right.
There are a lot of people who are very interested in hunting with flintlocks. But as Eric said, if you have a modern muzzleloader,
It's
they're
different,
pretty
yeah.
impressive. Yeah.
I always wondered why people were so interested in that, but it just brings back the old
Well,
days, I guess.
I got a deer in muzzleloader this season. I've told Mike this story where I ended up shooting at it 7 times with a muzzleloader. And I only hit it once. Luckily, the one time I hit it, it did the trick. But
Wow.
that was a bit of a miracle day.
Yeah,
People listening to the sound were going, "What is going on out there?"
yeah.
That's funny.
There's a very slow war going on.
So these things are flintlocks. Because
well-
I'm coming to in my head, I've got a picture of what that looks like with the big.
It has a chunk of flint,
Yeah, right.
a piece of rock
Yeah.
bolted into the hammer, and the
cool.
cover that covers the pan. And when the hammer comes down, as it knocks that cover open, it scrapes across the metal and creates a spark that goes into the little pile of powder in the pan,
Well, you hope.
and through the hole and
How it
ignites the
goes.
powder in the. But as I said, even that's far
Yeah,
more.
good for him.
That's the flintlock is far more probable to ignite than the matchlock.
Yeah. Wow.
Just as an interesting little aside, that is as
Exactly.
primitive as it gets.
So you were saying about season changes?
Season changes. So the archery season would run straight through. There would be there's been a lot of talk over the years about the value of potentially harvesting does that are taken on muzzleloader doe tags before the rut occurs. The rut being the breeding season.
Right.
Because then the bucks aren't chasing as many does around, aren't trying to breed as many does, and so they're able to breed more successfully with those that they are after. The reason we remove does is because in every wild population, we create more, nature creates a surplus. It requires it. Because especially in these northern climates, our winters are a limiting factor
Yeah.
on these animals. So what we're trying to do is, rather than have starvation move through a population, which I
Right.
spoke about this the last time
Yeah,
I was on
right,
here, but
exactly.
and I won't get into my little mathematical equation about it, but we want to remove that surplus ahead of the winter and make it accessible to folks to use.
Right.
And it creates a healthier herd to get through the winter and to get out of the winter as well. So there's been a lot of interest from the hunting public in having an earlier doe season. So there's a proposal for 4 days at the end of October with a muzzleloader that would only be for filling doe permits.
Oh.
And that would move the youth weekend ahead another weekend
Right.
or 2. This is all proposed at this point. And
Yeah.
there's been no votes on it. None of it's solid
Do
yet.
they
but
have a sportsman's legislative group? There's a group that talks
the Legislative
about
Sportsman's Caucus?
Yeah, because
Yes.
I was part of that when I was in
Yep.
the legislature.
Yep.
And do they still meet and weigh in
still
on
do.
this and
They still do.
understand this issue?
Yep.
That's good.
I don't know how much they get involved with the board stuff.
Yeah.
I couldn't speak to that, but they're still there. So we talked about doe permits a little bit. You would be able to utilize your doe permit. Currently, you can only fill it with a muzzleloader during the 9-day muzzleloader season
Yeah.
in December. With these new proposed rule changes, you would be able to fill it with your bow during the archery season if you so chose. You would also be able to fill it during this 4-day early
More
season,
opportunity.
and you would be able to fill it during the late season, the December season. We currently have a 3 deer limit annually. That limit would be removed, and you would be able to fill whatever tags you purchased.
Oh, I see, okay.
So
there is sort of a cap, but it's,
there's still a cap,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, the cap becomes 4, essentially,
right.
for the most part, with the exception of another proposal that
Right.
I'll talk about. So you would be able to purchase 2 archery tags. Those would obviously only be good for does. And then with your general license, you would get your buck tag, which could be used in any season for your 1 buck of the year. Then there are areas like Montpelier, where we are right now, that have some really significant overpopulation problems with deer. I think most of us who've been around Montpelier at all have heard about some of the habitat woes starting to
Right.
occur in Hubbard Park.
right?
I know
My
for a
backyard
fact.
in my house.
Yeah, I have
Wherever
a.
I keep asking to go over there during season.
Told
but
you,
haven't
sit
invited me
yourself
yet.
up and there you go.
I know somebody about a quarter mile from us here on Main Street who has deer in her yard every day like
Yeah,
clockwork.
yeah.
Right on Main Street.
Yeah, we have it right on our road all the time.
And the issue with allowing that to continue is that eventually the habitat's going to degrade to a point. You can rebuild a deer herd in a couple of years.
Yep.
You know, they tend to have twins, and it's
What
very
is causing
easy.
this? We're pushing them out
What's
of the
what's
woods?
causing this is that we're not hunting them here. People aren't accessing that resource here,
Yeah.
so they're able to breed at a very high rate. You know, if a doe has a couple of fawns, and one of those is a doe,
Yeah.
and the next year she has a couple of fawns, and her fawn has a couple of fawns,
Right,
so on and so forth. It's exponential to a degree.
yeah,
So there's a portion of this proposal that would create expanded archery zones. And those aren't all hammered out yet, but they would be areas like the city of Montpelier that has a problem where you really can't shoot a firearm.
right,
And the hope would be to be able to work with the citizens in the municipalities and help them to understand that they have a significant problem. And once you create a habitat problem, that takes 5 to 15 years to resolve. Once you degrade habitat, it's pretty severely damaged, and it takes a lot longer to grow a tree than it does to grow a deer.
right.
So these expanded archery zones would have tags available to purchase that were outside of the 4 tags
Who's
that
in
anyone can get
charge
for
of,
anywhere.
is that Fish and Wildlife's purview over these zones, or is that
It
the
is.
municipality can say this
Well,
is a zone?
see,
this is a-"
that's those are. This is all proposed.
Yeah,
So those are all discussions that are going to need to be
Okay.
had between the department and municipalities. And none of this is in cement yet. It hasn't even passed a first vote. But these are all concepts that are on the table. And then another really outside of the box concept that I love, and a lot of people may disagree with me on this, but I feel that recruitment and retention for hunting, even for fishing, should be a primary goal of ours. You know, as Eric mentioned, you know, nationally fishing's growing at 8%. Why aren't we?
Yeah.
We should be looking at that, knowing the economics of it, and we should also be looking at, you know, how do we grow more hunters? We're trying to manage, especially the deer herd. We're trying to manage a larger herd with less hunters.
I must say on Facebook, I love, oh, we only have 3 minutes left. I love seeing the pictures of a dad with his son, first deer.
Yep.
There's a couple I could mention, but it's on Facebook, friends of mine that are just like my son, you know, they're out hunting. It's a great bonding experience with the father and the son, and
Well,
pretty cool.
there's a proposal within these conceptual regulations that would create a novice hunting opportunity.
nice.
So if you were an adult who had never hunted, and the details of it again, you know, whether it would be 1 year, 2 years, what all the fine points of it would be,
Right.
but this would provide an opportunity for a mentored hunt for a novice hunter to go out on the youth weekend with somebody who was an experienced
Right.
hunter and be able to hunt with some relaxed rules and that would enhance their potential for success. In other words, they'd hunt on the youth weekend rules. They'd be able to shoot a spike horn. They'd be able to shoot a doe, and try to give them that opportunity for success, because fishing has a great deal of churn within it. So the person who 40% of the people who buy a license this year may not buy one next year, but 40% of the people who didn't buy one this year will make that up. Hunting, generally, if somebody becomes a hunter, they are a hunter. That, you know, they remain a hunter until they can't.
Right. What do we do with moose? Do we have a permitted?
That's a whole other episode,
that
I
right?
think.
I don't know if I can do that in 2 minutes.
in
I
2
can
minutes?
try.
It is an important topic,
Yeah,
and I think we should cover it. But I think in the last couple, maybe for the last couple minutes here, it'd be great to stick on the recruitment topic, because that's something that is really important. That was a major component in the discussion over Salisbury, and that's going to be a major component going forward as we decide how continue to fund Fish and Wildlife year after year. So what can be done as a community of sportsmen, sportswomen, to get more people involved? What does that take?
The simple answer, which I'm afraid sounds a bit glib, is take somebody out. You know, take somebody hunting, fishing, take them trapping. You know, take someone on the trap line with you and show them what you're doing, and at least give them some exposure to it. The secondary portion of that would be that you know, we have the Hale Mountain Fish and Game Club, the Lake Champlain Walleye Association, that are actually doing their own fish rearing to try to provide opportunities. You know, Hale Mountain is stocking for kids derbies, you know, and trying to get kids engaged at a young age with that type of a draw. You know, anywhere that we can create a point of contact for an individual with the hunting, fishing, trapping world, give them an opportunity for some experience, we should be doing that. And when we can support government in providing those opportunities, we should be as well, because you know, a perpetual decline is not sustainable. Fortunately, we're seeing some interest through the concepts of locally sourced foods, of organic foods.
Yeah.
I mean,
You
how
know,
perfect is that?
Yeah, hunted or fished or trapped food is locally sourced. It's organic. It's renewable. You know, it has great health benefits. It's entertaining and engaging to the locavore movement. And we're seeing the effects of that in terms of demographics that haven't been as engaged with those sports becoming engaged.
Well, and what about, just kind of as a last question here, if there are people who want to get into it, but they don't have family members that hunt or fish, or they don't have anybody to show them the ropes, so maybe they're a little scared to get into it with no base knowledge, where can they go to connect with the resources necessary to make them feel comfortable doing something they've never done before?
A great place to start is the internet. You know, we have conservation camps that the state runs, and those conservation camps are at an expense. You know, it's between $200 and $300, but many of the organizations in the state, the Vermont Federation of Sportsmen's Clubs, the Vermont Bear Hounds Association,
that say come out and we have to go because we've run out of time. Thank you very much. This was very interesting. We'll talk moose some other day.
All right.
Eric, thank you.
That's a good one.
Thanks, Eric.
I like the moose. Thank you for watching. I'm sure you found this very interesting as we did. And we'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.